There's a scene in MASH that I've watched there probably 30 times. Margaret Houlihan is standing outside her tent in the middle of the night. The camp is quiet. No incoming wounded, no crisis, no meeting to run or standard to enforce or battle to fight. Just Margaret, alone, in the dark, with her arms wrapped around herself like she's trying to hold something in rather than keep the cold out. And she just stands there. Not crying, not angry, not performing any of the things the show usually asked her to perform. Just standing in the quiet with a look on her face that the camera catches for about 4 seconds before someone calls her name and the mask comes back up and Major Houlihan returns to the field. 4 seconds. That's all you get. And for years I watched that moment and didn't fully register what I was seeing. Because the show had trained all of us to see Margaret Houlihan in a very specific way. The antagonist, the rule follower, the woman who reported Hawkeye and Trapper to command, the one who chose the army over the people standing right in front of her every single time without apparent hesitation or remorse. Hot Lips, the nickname the show gave her, the nickname she hated, the nickname that reduced her to a single dimension and then invited 11 seasons of audience contempt to fill the rest. But those 4 seconds, standing alone in the dark, holding herself together with her own arms.
Frank, it's for your own good. You need this operation.
That's not an antagonist. That's a person who is profoundly, quietly, exhaustingly alone. And once I started seeing her that way, I couldn't see the show the same way again, because we completely misunderstood Margaret Houlihan. All of us, for decades. And the show, to its credit, kept leaving us evidence. We just kept choosing not to look at it. To understand who Margaret Houlihan actually was, you have to understand who made her. Her father was a career army officer, Colonel Howitzer Houlihan, a man so defined by his rank and his service and his military identity that his nickname was a piece of artillery. And Margaret was his daughter, his only daughter. Growing up in an environment where the army wasn't a job or an obligation, but a complete world, a total system of meaning, a framework that explained everything from how you dressed to how you spoke to what you valued to who you were allowed to be. She didn't choose the army, she was born into it, the way some children are born into religions or family businesses or cultural expectations so total and so early that by the time you're old enough to choose, the choosing has already been done for you by forces you didn't consent to and can barely see. And her father, the man she adored, the man she tried so hard to make proud that the trying became indistinguishable from her personality. Here's the thing about Howitzer Houlihan that the show reveals slowly, painfully, across the seasons. He wasn't a warm man. He was a respected man, a capable man, a man who embodied everything the military asked of its officers. But warm, present in the way a daughter needs a father to be present, available to the specific, complicated, emotional person Margaret was underneath the uniform. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered most. And you can hear it in the way Margaret talks about him. The reverence is so complete, so carefully maintained that it has the quality of something constructed rather than something felt. You worship people at a distance. You love people up close. And Howitzer Houlihan, for all the space he occupied in Margaret's psychology, was always somehow at a distance, always slightly out of reach, always more impressed by excellence than by her. So she kept pursuing excellence. What else was there? Now here's where the show does something that took me years to fully appreciate. It shows you, across 11 seasons, a woman who built her entire identity around an institution that fundamentally did not see her as a full person. Margaret Houlihan was an exceptional nurse. Not competent, exceptional. Her skills in the OR were genuine, her standards were real, her ability to run a nursing unit under conditions that would break most people was not the rigid bureaucracy the show sometimes framed it as. It was mastery. Hard-won, meticulously maintained, genuinely impressive mastery of an extraordinarily difficult job. And the army, the institution she had given her entire life to, the framework that had organized her identity since childhood, that institution treated her as a subordinate, as an accessory to the male officers above her, as someone whose authority was always slightly provisional, always dependent on the cooperation of men who occasionally decided, for reasons of their own, not to cooperate. Think about how many times across the series Margaret has to fight to be taken seriously in her own domain, her own nursing unit, the area where she is demonstrably, objectively the most qualified person in the room. And she still has to fight. She still has to push back against the casual dismissal, the eye-rolling, the Frank Burns-style undermining that the show presents as comedy, but that, if you actually sit with it, is just sustained professional disrespect, directed at a woman who deserved better. She gave everything to the army. The army gave her a rank and a posting and a nickname she hated.
Oh, they wouldn't. They're not inhuman.
Before we go further, I want to stop here because I think this is the moment where this video either connects with you or it doesn't. Think about someone you wrote off. Not a villain, just someone you decided early on was a certain kind of person and then spent years interpreting everything they did through that lens. Someone whose rigidity you found irritating, whose standards you found excessive, whose way of moving through the world you never quite sympathized with. Someone who probably reminded you a little of Margaret Houlihan, actually. Wound tight, difficult to warm up to, more comfortable with rules than with mess, more fluent in competence than in vulnerability. And think about how rarely you looked past that first impression to ask what the rigidity was actually protecting, what the standards were compensating for, because the people who hold themselves and everyone around them to an exhausting standard are almost never doing it because they enjoy the exhaustion. They're doing it because somewhere along the way they learned at a very deep level that excellence was the price of belonging, that if they stopped being exceptional for even a moment, the belonging would be revoked. And that is not a personality flaw, that is a wound that learned to dress itself up as discipline. And then think about whether you ever actually looked at what was underneath it, what the rigidity was protecting, what the standards were compensating for, what the person behind the version you decided on was actually carrying. Drop it in the comments, because I think Margaret Houlihan is going to feel very familiar to a lot of people in this audience. And I think the recognition, when it lands, is going to be uncomfortable in exactly the right way. Let's talk about Frank Burns. Because Frank is essential to understanding Margaret's arc and the show's failure to fully reckon with what it was putting her through. In the early seasons, Margaret and Frank are having an affair. Frank is married. Margaret knows he's married. The show presents this as part of her characterization, evidence of her hypocrisy, her willingness to break rules she enforces for everyone else, the gap between her stated values and her actual behavior. And the audience accepted that framing almost universally, because the show delivered it with such confidence that questioning it felt unnecessary. But here's what that framing requires you to ignore. The specific circumstances of a woman in her position, in that era, in that institution, trying to build any kind of intimate life at all. The army was not a neutral environment for female officers navigating relationships. The options available to Margaret Houlihan for genuine emotional connection were narrow in ways the show never fully reckoned with. She couldn't pursue enlisted men, couldn't pursue most of the doctors without professional consequences that would have fallen entirely on her, couldn't be openly vulnerable with the nurses she supervised without undermining the authority her credibility depended on. Frank Burns was senior, available in the physical sense, and willing. And in the cramped emotional geography of the 4077th, that combination was rarer than it sounds. The affair wasn't hypocrisy dressed up as loneliness. It was loneliness that the show dressed up as hypocrisy. And those are not the same thing, and the difference matters enormously if you actually want to understand who Margaret was rather than simply confirm the version of her the show handed you in the first episode, and that reading isn't entirely wrong, but it's so incomplete that it might as well be wrong, because look at what Frank Burns actually offered Margaret Houlihan. Frank was her commanding officer, he was senior to her in rank. He was someone who, within the specific hierarchy that Margaret had organized her entire identity around, had authority and status and the particular kind of military legitimacy that she had been taught since childhood to respect. And he told her she was exceptional. He told her she was the best nurse he'd ever seen, the most professional officer in the unit, indispensable. He told her in the language of the institution she'd built her life around that she was valued, and Margaret, who had spent her entire life trying to earn exactly that validation from exactly that kind of source, responded to it. Not because she was naive, not because she was a hypocrite.
Talking about, and anyway, it's none of your business.
It might help to talk.
Because she was a person who had been taught that approval from authority was the highest available form of love, and Frank Burns was offering it, and she was hungry for it in a way that went back much further than career. She wasn't in love with Frank Burns. She was in love with the version of herself that Frank Burns reflected back at her. And that's one of the loneliest things in the entire show. If this kind of re-examination of characters you thought you understood is what you're here for, go ahead and subscribe. This is genuinely all we do. Find the hidden emotional architecture inside the people that millions of viewers watched without fully seeing. There's a lot more of this coming, and I don't want you to miss it. Now let's talk about the nickname. Because the nickname is not a small thing, and the show knows it isn't a small thing even while it keeps using it. Hot Lips. The show tells us Margaret hates it. She says so directly, more than once, in terms that are clear and unambiguous. She does not want to be called that. It reduces her to a body part. It strips away the rank, the accomplishment, the years of service, the professional identity she has worked her entire life to build, and replaces all of it with a reference to her mouth, to her physical attractiveness, to the way men looked at her rather than the way she wanted to be seen. And the people around her keep using it anyway. Hawkeye uses it, Trapper uses it, BJ uses it. Even people who genuinely like and respect Margaret use it casually, without thinking about it, because it's convenient and it's funny and she's asked them to stop, but asking them to stop is just more evidence that she's rigid and humorless and can't take a joke. And here's the thing that I find genuinely disturbing looking back. The show frames her discomfort with the nickname as a character flaw. Her insistence on being called Major Houlihan is presented as part of her uptightness, her inability to relax, her excessive attachment to rank and formality. The joke is partly on her for caring, but she's right to care. She's right. And nobody in the camp,
I thought something was bothering you and I wanted to help.
You're always trying to get into my head when there's nothing there.
and I mean nobody, not even the people she eventually comes to trust, ever fully gives her the dignity of acknowledging that she's right. They just keep using the nickname, and she keeps living with it, and the audience keeps laughing. And looking back at that now with any kind of clear eyes, it's not funny at all. It's a woman spending 11 seasons asking to be seen as a person and being answered again and again with a reminder of how she was first perceived. Let's talk about the marriage, because Donald Penobscot is one of the most quietly devastating elements of Margaret's story, and he's barely in the show. Margaret meets Donald and falls for him with a completeness that's genuinely touching. She is fully, openly, unguardedly happy in a way we almost never see her. The professional armor comes down, the rigidity softens. The woman underneath Major Houlihan, the one who wants to be loved, who wants a home, who wants something that belongs to her outside of the army, and the OR and the endless performance of competence. That woman is right there on the surface, visible and vulnerable and real. And she marries him. And then the marriage falls apart. Not dramatically, not with a single catastrophic event. It falls apart the way things fall apart when two people discover, too late, that the version of themselves they presented during courtship couldn't survive the sustained pressure of actual life together. Donald is absent. Donald is unfaithful. Donald is, in the end, another person who offered Margaret a specific kind of validation and then turned out not to be able to back it up with anything substantial. And Margaret has to absorb this while still showing up to the OR, still running her nursing unit, still being Major Houlihan in every external way, because Major Houlihan is the only stable identity she has, and if that goes too, there is nothing left to stand on. The show handles the deterioration of the marriage with more sensitivity than it handles most things involving Margaret. There are moments of genuine pathos, but it moves on relatively quickly because the show always moves on, and because Margaret moves on, and because moving on without visible damage is what Margaret Houlihan does. She had been doing it her whole life. Here's where I want to slow down because I think this is the emotional center of everything. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being in a room full of people who have decided who you are. Not people who hate you, not enemies, people who have just settled on a version of you, who have decided that you are the rigid one, the difficult one, the one who enforces rules other people would rather ignore, the one who can't take a joke, the one whose nickname you keep using even though she's asked you not to, and who interact with you through that settled version rather than the actual person standing in front of them. That's the loneliness Margaret Houlihan lived with for the entire series. She was surrounded by people who were capable of tremendous warmth, tremendous loyalty, tremendous emotional generosity toward each other.
Doing yourself a favor keeping a cork on it, let it out.
Let out what? There is nothing to let out.
Toward Hawkeye and BJ and Radar and Klinger and Potter. The 4077th was in many ways one of television's great portraits of improvised community, of people becoming family through shared extremity. And Margaret was in that community, physically present, professionally essential, occasionally even included, but she was never quite inside it, not all the way. There was always a degree of separation between Margaret and the warmth that flowed so freely between everyone else. Some of it was her own doing. Her defenses were real and they were high, and she had worked very hard to build them. But some of it was the camp's doing. Some of it was 11 seasons of Hot Lips, and eye rolls at her standards, and jokes at her expense. and a fundamental unwillingness to fully extend to her the same grace that everyone else extended to each other. She was the last person anyone would have described as lonely. She was one of the loneliest people in the camp. I want to talk about the moments when her competence actually broke through, the moments when even the people who found her most difficult had to stop and acknowledge what they were watching.
About a little dog!
There are scenes across the series, quiet ones usually, where Margaret is in the OR and something goes wrong. Not something that required a doctor, something that required a nurse. And Margaret handles it with a speed and a precision and a complete calm authority that stops the room for a second. No performance, no politics, no rigidity or rule following or any of the things she got mocked for. Just pure, clean, irreplaceable skill. And in those moments, the people around her, Hawkeye included, Hawkeye especially, look at her with something that is unmistakably respect. Real respect, the kind you can't manufacture. And then the moment passes, and someone makes a joke, and the eye-rolling resumes, and Margaret goes back to being Hot Lips in the general estimation of the room. But I think she noticed those moments. I think she held them. I think they were, for Margaret, the emotional equivalent of what the dresses were for Klinger or the jokes were for Hawkeye. A proof of concept. A reminder that underneath everything the camp thought of her, there was something real and valuable and worth defending. She defended it by maintaining her standards, by refusing to lower the bar, by insisting, in the face of constant social pressure, to relax and go along and stop being so intense about everything, on being exactly who she was. And everyone called it rigidity. She called it survival. Let's talk about her friendship with Hawkeye. Because it developed slowly, across many seasons, and by the end of the show it's one of the most genuinely moving relationships in the entire series. And the journey it takes is, I think, the most honest thing the show ever did with Margaret's character. In the early seasons, Hawkeye and Margaret are adversaries in a way that the show mostly plays for comedy. He mocks her, she reports him, he undermines her authority, she enforces rules he finds absurd. They are, in the traditional sitcom sense, foils, defined partly in opposition to each other, their conflict a reliable source of tension and humor. But something shifts, slowly, across many seasons and many shared extremities. The shift is almost invisible at first. A moment of unexpected kindness here, a moment of genuine professional respect there, and then gradually the moments accumulate, and the accumulated weight of them starts to change the dynamic in ways that neither character fully acknowledges out loud. By the later seasons, there is real tenderness between them. Not romantic, or not primarily romantic, but something in some ways more meaningful than romance. The tenderness of two people who have seen each other at their worst and their most frightened and their most human, and who have arrived, despite everything, at something that functions like understanding. And what I find most moving about that arc is what it implies about Margaret. She was always capable of that warmth. It was always there. The person who eventually became Hawkeye's genuine friend, who sat with him in serious moments and matched him in genuine ones, and brought a quality of presence to the relationship that made it feel real. That person existed at the beginning of the series too. She was just buried under layers of armor that the camp's treatment of her had made necessary. The warmth wasn't a character development. It was an excavation. Now I want to talk about the thing the show does with Margaret in the finale, because I think it's the most emotionally honest thing it ever gave her, and it almost slips past you if you're not paying attention. In Goodbye, Farewell and Amen, as the war ends and the camp dismantles, everyone faces the question of what comes next, what life looks like on the other side of Korea, what they're going back to, and who they'll be when they get there. Margaret's answer is quieter than most. She's going back to the army, to a new posting, a new unit, a new set of professional responsibilities. Not back to a person, not back to a home in the domestic sense. The army is still her answer because the army has always been her answer, because it's the only framework she has ever fully inhabited. But there's something different in how she holds it now. There's a scene near the end where she says her goodbyes, and in the way she moves through those goodbyes, in the specific quality of attention she gives to each person, the way she allows herself to be hugged rather than simply enduring it, the way her face stays open instead of managed, you can see it. The armor is thinner than it was at the beginning. Not gone. It will never be entirely gone, but thinner, more permeable, more willing to let things through. Korea changed her. Not in the simple way that extreme experiences are supposed to change people, not with a neat before and after transformation, in the real way, the complicated way, the way that leaves you simultaneously more capable and more wounded, more open and more aware of exactly why the armor was necessary in the first place. She leaves the 4077th more herself than she arrived. Not the self the army made, not the self the nickname reduced her to, not the self that Frank Burns reflected back at her, or that her father's approval required her to be, something closer to the actual Margaret. The one who had been there all along, standing in the dark outside her tent with her arms around herself, holding something in. And that's the tragedy and the triumph of Margaret Houlihan, wrapped up together in a way you can't fully separate. She spent 11 seasons being misread by almost everyone around her, including the audience. She spent 11 seasons being called a nickname she hated and having her standards mocked and her authority questioned and her emotions pathologized and her genuine excellence treated as a personality defect rather than a professional achievement. And she showed up anyway, every single day, in the OR and in the mess tent and in the staff meetings, and in every crisis the 4077th threw at her. She showed up and she did the work and she maintained the standards and she kept the nursing unit running at a level that saved lives. Actual lives. Real people who went home because Margaret Houlihan refused to lower the bar, even when everyone around her was begging her to. She never got the credit for it. Not the full credit. Not the credit that matched what she actually contributed. She was essential to everyone, fully seen by almost no one. And the worst part, the part that I genuinely cannot shake, is that she knew it. On some level, behind the rigidity and the standards and the professional armor she had been building since childhood, she knew that the camp she served so completely had decided who she was long before they knew her. That the nickname was going to stick no matter how many times she asked them to stop. That the warmth she was capable of was going to stay mostly invisible, because the version of her they'd settled on didn't have room for it. She knew, and she showed up anyway. That's not a villain. That's one of the bravest people in the entire show. We just spent decades too busy laughing at the nickname to notice. Drop your video ideas in the comments. The best ones always come straight from you. See you in the next one.